We've now come to the final presentation of this conference. Our next speakers have worked together on and off for more than 25 years. William Bratton is the two-time former police commissioner of New York City, the former chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, and the former police commissioner of the Boston Police Department. John Miller is the deputy commissioner of intelligence and counterterrorism for the New York City Police Department. Joining these two distinguished men on stage is Suffolk County Undersheriff Kevin Catalina. Undersheriff Catalina previously served as deputy chief and commanding officer of the New York City Police Department's Intelligence Bureau, Operational and Analytical Section. Throughout his 26-year career with the NYPD, Kevin Catalina held a range of positions related to counter-terrorist operations and investigations, logistical planning, and site security. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner William Bratton, Deputy Commissioner John Miller, and Undersheriff Kevin Catalina.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
All right, good afternoon. And thank you so much for coming, both of you. On behalf of Sheriff Toulon, we couldn't appreciate it more. We understand you had a long ways to come from New York City, and
he was in the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, even that's a long way, but we do appreciate it. Just a little bit about today. I'm just going to ask both of you some questions and kind of a reflection on your career, and both of you are very impressive careers, and then maybe a little bit about where we're going in policing today and what your opinions of all that's happening nowadays are. So just a little bit. First and foremost, I just want to wish Commissioner Bratton a happy birthday.
Thank you.
Today is his birthday. And also, Commissioner Bratton has a new book out, The Profession. If anybody hasn't read it, fantastic book, as are some of his other books as well. And before I forget, I know Commissioner Miller also has a book called The Cell, which is, for anybody who's in the counterterrorism world, it's an absolutely essential read. So it's another great book. Just a little bit about kind of how it all started. Commissioner Bratton, I know you started out in Vietnam as a military police officer, and thank you for your service. You came back to Boston and worked as a young cop in Boston for a while, rose up very, very quickly. Later became commissioner of that department. I think prior to that, you were commissioner of the Boston Metro Police Department, later the New York City Transit Police Department, later the New York City Police Department twice, as well as the Los Angeles Police Department. So pretty much unparalleled career as far as law enforcement goes. I'm sure you have many stories to tell about it, so we'd love to hear about them. Commissioner Miller, I know your path was slightly different. You started chasing crime kind of in a different way as a journalist, but very interesting time in the 70s and 80s following the Gambino crime family, and some really super interesting stuff that we'd love to hear about. Later, got into law enforcement and an equally distinguished career, DNI, FBI, New York City Police Department twice as a commissioner, and as well as the LAPD, where you did some incredibly innovative stuff. So we'd love to hear about all of that and kind of how it all started, and maybe kind of the intersection in the early 90s when you guys got together and really transformed the New York City Police Department.
Well, sum and substance of what you just laid out in terms of my career, as you can tell, I have a hard time holding a job. Sometimes I leave voluntarily, sometimes I get a little shove out the door. But it's been a truly interesting 51 years, and the more recent book, The Profession, is about that 51-year career. Tomorrow, October 7th, will mark the 51st anniversary of my joining the Boston Police Department, 23 years old, 150 pounds at the time, part of the largest police class in the history of that department, 156 officers, a lot of us just literally coming back from the Vietnam War. And over these 50-odd years that I have never seen a time like this time the closest to this time in the sense of all the issues that all of you are now facing, that I get to observe from the outside and sometimes participate in. You'd have to go back to 1970 when I joined the Boston Police Department. At the beginning of the book, I have a quote that I stole from John Timoney, the late great John Timoney, my first deputy commissioner. Then he went on to Philadelphia and Miami. And that quote, the paraphrase is, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Those who know cops know we don't know our history. And that's true. We don't teach it. Our recruits, when they come in, we don't teach them the history of the department. I dare say most of us don't read about the history of policing. I love history, so in addition to always liking it in school, when I gravitated toward policing, I spent a lot of time reading about police history. And it is important, because with history, you can learn mistakes that were made, you can learn successes, how they occurred, so you don't repeat the mistakes, but better still that you repeat the successes. And I think some of the success that I think I've had in the profession is because of that understanding of history. And what you're going through now, you were still in the profession, does remind me in some respects of where the profession was back in 1970. The tremendous lack of trust in the capabilities of the police, coming out of an era that was accentuated by issues of racism, corruption, brutality, very commonplace in American policing, very commonplace in the department I joined, the Boston, in 1970. In this region of the country, you had the Knapp scandals, basically, in New York, the corruption scandals, and the issues around race, the race riots. And 50 years later, we're still dealing with the issues of race. We're still dealing with issues of trust. Unfortunately, we're still dealing with corruption of a different type, not organized like it was back in the 70s. Still pockets of it. But it is a time to understand the history, because so much of that history can inform what you're going to do going forward. And that's what I tried to do with the book, was to literally, it's a memoir, but it's a historical tutorial also. The idea of things that worked, things that didn't work. Don't repeat my mistakes, repeat some of my successes, and repeat some of our successes. As it's appropriate that John Miller and I are sitting here beside each other, because I attribute so much of my success over these last 25 years to John and people like John, people who love the profession, Jack Maple, John Timoney, Louis Anamone. And I've been very fortunate in my career to have assembled around me an extraordinary group of people. Jim Collins writes in his book, get the right people on the bus, wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. And I think I've had that good fortune, the departments I've led, to do that. And fortunately, this guy got on the bus with me quite a few times.
And under the bus at least once.
Well, we both got under the bus the first time.
It's better to be on the bus.
Giuliani rode over both of us. But in any event, these are, what's the expression in the Tale of Two Cities, the best of times, worst of times? These are the best of times in some respect, when you think of the technology that's available to you now, the skill set, the body of knowledge. We have come so far from the 1960s and 70s. But it's the worst of times also, in the sense that you'd have to go back to the 60s and 70s to a time when the police profession was so under attack. But the good news is, unlike the 60s and 70s, you were so much better prepared to defend, to go on the offense, because we have become a profession over these last 50 years, and that we have such a foundation to stand on that we didn't have 50 years ago. And the good news is that that foundation can continually be expanded, as it has for the last 50 years. And so there's so many good things happening in the profession, including the leadership. The leadership of today far exceeds anything I experienced in the 70s and 80s. And in the 90s, policing leadership really broke out and really began to shape the profession. So it's been a good ride. I get to still stay involved somewhat. I miss it. I miss it every day. I miss the excitement of the challenge, the crises, the opportunity. But as you can see, I'm a little more casually attired than the rest of you today. So in terms of my new position in the private sector, I get to dress like this most days. So there is a different life after policing, a little more lucrative life, but one that's less stressful, but in some respects less satisfying. Because I've never found, despite all the crises that John and I and so many others have dealt with over the years, even in the midst of crises, that the satisfaction of if you dealt with it effectively, that and the idea of leading a department to improve its image and success, there's nothing quite like it. I have an expression I think you all are aware of: cops count, police matter. The individual action of one cop, the collective actions of the police profession, that we count, we matter, we make a difference. And at the end of your career, isn't it great to look back on that career and think that your life mattered, your profession mattered, and that you had a life of significance? And I don't think there's any profession that can rival that opportunity that you get every day to make a difference.
Commissioner Miller, any reflections on that?
What he said.
How did you guys come together? How did that all happen back in the 90s?
Well, the commissioner mentioned Jack Maple. Jack Maple was a singular character in policing. He was your average cop who wore a Homburg hat, two-tone Spectator shoes, a double-breasted suit, and a bow tie.
Don't forget the welding sunglasses.
Yes, of course. So, you know, he would kind of step onto the scene looking, I mean, it was almost as if he came in black and white. He looked like something out of the 40s. But Jack was a guy who wanted to be noticed because he had a lot to say. And in meeting him, he started explaining to me his theories on crime, on policing, on the city. And I was a reporter at NBC. And then destiny would take a hand. Mayor Giuliani was elected to run New York City. He was looking for a new police commissioner. Jack was the special assistant to Chief Bratton of the Transit Police, who had gone off to be police commissioner of Boston. And we literally conspired. We sat and plotted about how to bring him back, because when Jack brought this up to Commissioner Bratton in Boston, he said, I'm in this job for 6 months. I mean, you don't take a job and just leave. And, you know, our whole argument was, but it's the NYPD. I mean, this is the big game, the big show, the big place. And, you know, as we plotted and he resisted, I broached the idea to Jack, because he said, you know, who will we get to handle the press stuff? Because there's going to be a lot of press stuff. We're going to change how this is going. We're going to have to explain to people, this is what we're going to do. Then we got to tell them we're doing it. Then we got to tell them we did it. I mean, this is going to be a sea change. And I was a crime reporter at NBC, and I said to Jack, well, why don't I do it? And he said, you can't do that. You know, you're in like a great job, you know, making a lot of money. You'd be crazy. And I'm like, we've already established that. So I went for what I think was my first job interview in my life, you know, to meet Bill Bratton in a warehouse, you know, that they'd set up for the transition team.
So prior to that, you didn't even know Commissioner Bratton?
We had met once at a
John,
parade.
let me set the stage in terms of, and then you can go into more detail, but setting the stage. I'm the police commissioner designate, succeeding Ray Kelly. And Ray set up an office for me in literally a spare furniture warehouse that with stacks of chairs and tables all over the place.
It was like you're doing the transition. You could just move into the school book depository building.
And had a detective assigned to me, Jimmy Motto, who became my number one. And Jimmy, I think, is known to many of you in this audience, certainly. And Jack wants me to meet and interview John Miller, the foremost investigative reporter in New York, who I knew only really through watching him on TV with his $2,000 Brioni suits and his long cigars and his reputation for the nightlife. And,
I don't know what he's talking about.
and he comes, and it's the only time in my life I've ever seen Miller nervous. He was nervous, sitting in that chair across that old beat-up desk I was sitting behind. And that's when the, what's it now, John, 27 years? 27 years that we've been together. And in terms of the idea of what might not have been if we hadn't clicked, you, myself, Maple, Jiminy, in the sense of the history of the department back then, but also our time together in LAPD and our time together again in the NYPD. To give you a sense of the respect I have for John, that I would not have taken the LAPD job if he had not agreed once again to give up his very lucrative career working with Barbara Walters, the job that he loved greatly, that on Friday night. And similarly, I don't think I would have taken the police commissioner job the second time around if he had not agreed to come back as head of counterterrorism for me. It's just an indication of the mark of respect I have for his capabilities, talent, and his humor. He's always able to provide a good laugh in the midst of all these crises we deal with.
I was not exactly a hard sell when it came to agreeing to take these jobs, though. So it was
Been a good one.
very rewarding.
Well, we're all better off for it. So you mentioned before putting the right people on the bus and then finding the right seats for them. And it seems like you've done that, very successfully over the years. And I understand maybe how Jack Maple came to you, and I understand how John Miller came to you, but the Louis Anamones and the John Timonys and some of the other key players, how have you been so successful in identifying them and putting them in the right seats?
Some of what we wanted to talk about today was the issue of leadership. I like being a leader. Since I was a young kid, I always sought to be the leader. I don't know where it comes from, but that's me. I like being the leader. And one of the great things about being the leader, particularly if you have had the career I've had, is that you get jobs where you're allowed to pick your team. And I always describe the most exciting part of taking on a new assignment, Boston, New York, twice, LA, is the ability to put the team together. And the excitement of that the idea of creating a Super Bowl team. And I write about that in all three of my books, about that, the importance of surrounding yourself with the right people. I think I'm pretty smart. I think I'm a pretty good leader. But I'll tell you, I don't have all the answers. And there's a lot of other people that have a lot better answers than I could ever create. And so that's where Jack Maple comes into the game. Smartest person I've ever met on dealing with issues of crime. Anybody I've ever met matched Maple in terms of his understanding of crime and how to deal with it. Miller, nobody I've ever met understood how to deal with the issues of media the way John does. And then also the capabilities he acquired over time of dealing with issues of intelligence and counterterrorism. And so the idea of leadership is critically important, but for me, it's always been a rewarding experience because I like making decisions. I like dealing with crises. I'm a risk taker. To take the transit police job in 1990, I was 19 years into a 20-year pension in Boston, and I left Boston with no assurity that I'd get back there to get that pension reactivated, to come to New York City, a city I'd only visited several times, to take over a police department that was always in an extraordinary morale crisis. It was always New York's third police department, the tunnel rats, the old police, as Jack would describe them. Jack had a story about, a transit cop would be at a party, and he'd be talking somebody up, and they'd ask, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm a cop." "And where?" "New York City." "Oh, where? Where are you assigned?" "Transit." "Oh." The idea that transit had so little respect and regard in the profession. And the excitement of coming into that demoralized department and effectively over the course of 2 years, making it with the help of Maple and so many others in that department who really got on the platform with me, made it into the Marine Corps of NYPD police departments, and the morale and the satisfaction of that. So leadership is critical and something I've always strived for. I like making decisions. The fewer people I have over me, the better. And so I've consciously sought from being a young patrolman all the way up to always try to get into a leadership position, because there's nothing quite like the thrill of when you got your team around you, you got crises to deal with, and you deal with it successfully. And if you don't, to then also have the ability to then come back together and understand why you didn't, so that the next time you are going to be able to accomplish it. And that Jim Collins' book is a very interesting one, because so much of what he talked about, I think I've just been able to do naturally and had the opportunity to do naturally. Right people on the bus, the flywheel concept. The idea of the flywheel, trying to get that thing to get in motion. One pair of hands is going to make it very difficult, but you get a whole bunch of hands that are all moving in the same direction, and you can just acquire great speed, and then it takes off on its own. So in my case, I've always sought, when I take an assignment, I don't take an assignment to stay in it for 10, 15 years. I'm in for the fun of change, the fun of reform, the fun of picking a team so that when I get off the bus, somebody that's on the bus behind me gets to move up into that front seat. The only time that didn't happen was with John Chimney. Giuliani had a different idea. We were grooming John when I was ready to leave to move John into that slot. Giuliani had his own ideas, moved Howard Safin into the position. But in LA, I was able to put Charlie Beck in after I left, now Mike Moore, my recommendation also. And then in terms of in the NYPD, giving Mayor de Blasio a talent pool to basically choose from people on the bus. It's always the mayor's decision, but the idea as a leader is to create a talent pool that you're not dependent on just one person, but that talent. And John, you can speak to this because you've certainly been on the bus oftentimes enough.
Well, so it's actually a very interesting question, and I think the commissioner has framed it from his point of view. You know, being a click below him, you get a very different point of view, which is, you know, you look at different leadership styles in policing. Ray Kelly was kind of the micromanager style leader, which was amazing to watch because he had an enormous capacity to be the police commissioner, but also the chief of department, but also the chief of patrol. It doesn't mean that he performed their daily functions, but everything they did went up through him. And it was the kind of leader who had ideas and picked people that he thought was capable of carrying those ideas forward. It's a management style. Commissioner Bratton and people like him out there in the private sector and the public sector, he has ideas, but that recruiting process, we're going to pick the team. You would go under people and push people up. You would go around people and bring people from the side. It was a very careful selection, whether it was LA or New York the first time or New York the second time, or the transit police. And what he was looking for as a guy who had ideas was, he was searching for people within the organization who had different ideas or better ideas. That's where you find Jack Maple. That's where you find Louis Anamone. And the idea of not saying, just carry forward my ideas, but give me your better ideas and let me empower them and let me empower you to act as a leader in your own right. That has been, to me, as a guy who's worked for a lot of different kinds of managers, whether it was the director of national intelligence or the director of the FBI, or Commissioner Bratton, who was always my standard for, like, if I was going to write the leadership book or follow one that he already wrote, was the standard, which is, it's a little bit Abe Lincoln. Even if you get a team of rivals, find people that you think might even be smarter than you, and let them drive forward. And that's been amazing to watch. I obviously snuck in unqualified, but it's been amazing to watch.
In describing my leadership team, particularly first time in New York in '94, I describe myself as sort of the ringmaster in the cage with lions, tigers, and bears, because they were an extraordinary group of big personalities. And you in this audience know some of the people: Chimney, Anamone, Maple, Miller, and some of the others. And you get them into a room, and they were very interesting trying to control. You wanted them to effectively roar. You wanted them to be themselves, but you wanted them to effectively, ultimately work as a team. And so the term team of rivals that John's talking about with Lincoln, I love that book about team of rivals, because Lincoln had a war cabinet that basically half of them were trying to push him out as president, get to be president. But he basically understood their skills, their strengths, and the politics of it. And so in my case, that one of the things that I was always comfortable as a leader is that I was never worried about somebody wanting my job. I wanted them to be hungry for my job, because I was only intended to stay for a couple of years. I wasn't going in there for 20 or 30 years. So that I could encourage them to effectively think of themselves as being the next chief, the next commissioner, and provide visibility for them so that the mayor, whether it's de Blasio or Hahn or Villaraigosa in LA, put these weekly meetings together where I'd bring my team into the mayor's office so the mayor could hear and see them. It wasn't just me going in, protecting the ideas that were coming from the team. They came in to talk themselves about their ideas, about what they were doing. So I think it was pretty smart on my part because it built up confidence in the mayor. It wasn't just me, it was the team. And the idea that that team is a pretty deep bench. And in both New York twice and LA, I had a very deep bench, extraordinary deep bench. And it's, for me, part of the motivation to be a leader, the idea of providing opportunity for others to be leaders, to provide the training for them, send them off to school. And it's worked for me. And I think in the sense of understanding history, I think it can work for all of you also in the sense of as you seek to move up in an organization, that no one person can do it alone. It is all about collaboration. It is the essentiality of what we do, the idea of collaboration. One of the things that Mil and I agree on, and he's the ultimate best at, one of the skills that he has that I don't necessarily have. I have the support of the concept, but the personality to pull it off. That I'm seen sometimes as cool, aloof, maybe even standoffish. John is just the opposite. John is hail fellow, well met, and there's some of the issues we faced in LA, in New York, where there was tremendous tension between organizations. And when I came back to New York in 2014, everybody hated the NYPD, FBI, Port Authority. It was a mess in the sense of the idea of collaboration. So rather than me doing it, I authorized it, and then John did it. John basically made the rounds, and much to the surprise of people, we want to work with you, and we're serious about wanting to work with you. And it's worked. And it did the same thing in LA with the Sheriff's Department, the other 43 police departments in LA County that we had to work with, and the FBI there. In fact, I think that's the reason John got the job at the Bureau. Mueller understood how good he was at basically getting agencies to work together with each other.
From somebody who worked in the New York City Police Department back in the time you're describing when I think we were having a difficult time collaborating, it was a welcome change. It really was. And I think at times, reflecting on that, we were almost, I think, guilty of not seeing the forest through the trees as a result of a leadership style that did not encourage that idea sharing and collaboration, and it was unfortunate. Because,
There's all types of different leadership styles. It's ultimately up to you to determine what yours is going to be, because all styles have some degree of success, in terms of different personalities, different styles. Some people manage and lead by fear, others by inspiration, others by delegation. I have a nickname going back to Boston that I have a wonderful caricature by the Bobby Neville, the police artist in the BPD, the great delegator. That I love delegating. Why? Makes my life easier. When I go home at night, and John can tell you this, and having worked with the NYPD and LAPD, I took no work at home with me. I didn't go home with briefcases full of reports, et cetera. Other people did, but I didn't, because I delegated it all out, because I trusted them to basically give me their best advice. And so that style worked for me. Might not work for you. That case of Ray Kelly, an extraordinary manager, effective leader, but his style was that he wanted to see every piece of paper. Bernard Parks, the chief I succeeded in LA, very similar style. Everything had to flow up through him. That was his style, and it just ended up with phenomenal roadblocks, and one of the reasons the department was stagnating. But ultimately it comes down to you making a decision as to what works for you in your department. I just like to think what's worked for me is the better way to effectively do it.
I think one other thing about style was, Rudy Giuliani was another kind of autocratic, if not micromanaging, certainly autocratic management style. The commissioner talked about lead by fear, lead by inspiration, lead by example. That was an administration where you would go to meetings and the mayor would put an idea on the table, and it was, okay, how do we move forward with that idea? And, a couple of times early on, somebody said, well, that might not be the best idea because, it has the risk of this problem and that problem. And, those people, and I might have been one of them, were taken on the side after a meeting saying, you never go against the mayor. You're being disloyal. I'm like, I'm not being disloyal. I'm trying to reduce risk for the principal here. But you got to learn, those meetings were for people to voice their agreement. At the very same time, we had a contentious meeting about a particularly sensitive issue at police headquarters. And the command staff was around the table in the commissioner's conference room. And the discussion got interestingly heated. And a couple of people went back and forth, and a third joined in. And you could see other people sit back. And I asked the commissioner after the meeting broke up, why did you let that meeting get out of control? People were yelling at each other, and, you didn't step in. And he said, oh, I got a lot out of that meeting. First of all, I was able to learn who had the information in the room, who had a different perspective from that information in the room. I got to learn who had passions and strong feelings about issues. And I got to see who sat back, even though it was in their area of responsibility, who didn't say anything at all. And at the end, when I left the meeting, I made the decision and came back in and said, this is what we're going to do. But I learned a lot by not interrupting that. This is something that would have never occurred to me as, kind of the, all right, settle down. But it was an interesting lesson in leadership kind of opportunities as to what you can get out of a moment like that.
Reflective of that, John, tell us the story briefly about you, myself, Maple, in the meeting with Giuliani in his office about the idea of more arrests.
So we were starting to have real success against crime, and the number of shootings were going down, the number of robberies were going down, and the number of arrests were starting to trail down as crime declined. And there was an article in the newspaper about how Chicago was doing checkpoints at intersections and bridges, and they were making, gun arrests. And we said, well, our crime is going down. Our arrests should be going down with it. They should track each other, Jack Maple said. And the mayor said, no, this goes up, that's arrests, and this goes down, that's crime. And, it was one of those, he wasn't to be argued with. And we walked out into the parking lot, and I said to Jack, what was that about? And the commissioner said, I think that went well. And I said, what went well about that? And Jack said, I thought it was great. I'm like, the fuck are you talking about? And he said, I have a GED from Brooklyn Tech. I just never imagined that the mayor of the city of New York would be yelling at me. So, everybody had their own view of those days.
Although Jack indicated that the chair he was sitting in, he was next to the table, and the table was kind of wobbly. And it was getting so heated that Jack thought he was going to have to basically rip the table leg off and start beating the mayor with it to make his point. By extension of that story...
Every time we came back into the mayor's office, he used to go like this with the table to see if that leg was still loose.
By extension of that story, the idea of understanding your history, what the mayor did not understand was something that we did, we believed in firmly. I've talked about it as the bell curve, the tipping point concept that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about. His first article in New York Magazine and his subsequent book, The Tipping Point, was on watching what had happened with crime in New York in the early 90s when we came in, where all of a sudden it seemed like it was disappearing. And he compared it to an epidemic, the idea, we've certainly just seen that with coronavirus, that it multiplies and expands, but if you can then find a vaccine, it'll then diminish the bell curve. And effectively, same thing, that's what we had found with crime, that the arrests were going to have to go up for a period of time, quality of life, serious crime, but you're going to also reduce the opportunity and the amount of crime, so then arrests would go down. That was the goal. And you and the Sheriff's Department appreciate this, otherwise, think of it, Rikers had 22,000 people a day back in 1994. We used to count every day to see how many people could we arrest so we'd be at the maximum capacity. Rikers basically got down to about 14,000 for a while. It's down to around 6,000, too low. There needs to be more people in rather than out. But the idea was that Giuliani just didn't get that concept, and not understanding your history under Commissioner Safer, a year or so after we all left, after we got off the bus. Our most successful unit was Louis Anamone's street crime unit, the gun unit. 100 cops under Inspector Savage, was that his name? Highly trained, 4 of them to a car, jump out, all trained that when they pulled up on somebody, every one of them knew what the other was going to do as they jumped out of that car. Highly trained, 25 teams of them. Safer comes in, the mayor's demanding more arrests. They expand that unit fourfold, 400 officers. Geez, that sounds pretty good. Except they didn't do the training, didn't do the selection. And what was one of the first things that happened shortly after that expansion? Amadou Diallo. 4 cops who had never worked together before that night, who come up on a guy, suspicious. The 4 cops hop out, no plan, 41 shots. This is where understanding your history comes in and is so important. So I think back to that meeting with Giuliani back in '94 and how he didn't really understand the lesson that we were trying to impart to him, and that 3 years later jammed the department up and those 4 young cops, because we sent them out, and that's part of the obligation of leadership. If you're going to ask them to do a job, train them for it. And in the current crisis that you're in right now, this foolishness of the defund the police movement, thankfully the pendulum that had been swinging wildly to the left and after George Floyd was almost going to go off the hinge, is coming back. And the first sign of that is the debunking of defund the police. Most of the politicians who were embracing it and hugging it understood that basically it's not what the public really wanted. So now we are seeing a momentum to basically bring back the cops, to hire the cops back. And I'm arguing, and something I think all of you can appreciate, learn from your history. Time and again, where have cops got jammed up when we send them out to do a job? They've got jammed up because we just don't train them enough to do what we're asking them to do. So I look at the Eric Garner case, 2 cops who had never worked together before, out on an assignment, simple enough, basically deal with guys selling loose cigarettes on a corner. But the 2 of them basically didn't have a plan when they got out of the car, didn't have the appropriate training to deal with the issue. And I've seen that time again over 50 years with a lack of training. And it goes back to my time. I'm out of the Boston Police Department after 8 weeks of training back in 1970. Uniformed traffic cop, bad enough. But then the 2 weeks after that, they put us in the plainclothes working pickpocket squads in the subways in the downtown department stores at Christmas. Frankie Corbusier and I teamed up, 2 partners, basically with all of 10 weeks on the job with our guns and our badges. We go to arrest a pickpocket, young black kid on the subway in Washington Street subway station, and we get him up against the wall. Frankie's holding him against the wall. All of a sudden, I got a crowd around me, and they see two white guys, plain clothes, basically hassling this black kid. It's an all-black crowd, and I'm there. I got my gun out. I got my badge out, but that made no difference to that crowd. All they see is this 2 guys hassling this kid screaming at his top of his lungs. I had no training how to deal with any of that. None of it. Thank God 2 transit cops came along in uniform who basically took charge of the situation. That incident has stayed with me for 50 years. And so I have always pushed for training, training, training. So as we get into the refund the police movement, that refunding, so much of it needs to focus on the training. Ben Tucker's in here with some of his people from the NYPD. Some of the training that we tried to put in starting in 2014, some of the most modern in the country. And one of the things we had for 4 years, that I was there 3 years, 4 years, for the first time in my 50 years, we had unlimited funds. After the tragic deaths of Ramos and Lou, the murder of those 2 young cops, the money was forthcoming for everything we wanted to do. And we were able to do extraordinary amounts of training. But you can never do enough. You need to keep doing more. So that goes back to my first experience, 8 weeks, 10 weeks on the job. The discussion in Giuliani's office, it still stays with me that he didn't get it. And then subsequently Diallo. And then over time, even as recently as my time with the Eric Garner tragedy, which was part of the whole assortment of issues in the last 5 years that have caused so much lack of trust in the police. If we're going to send them out to do a job, we need to train them properly, equip them properly. And that's the challenge for leadership, you the leaders now, to convince the politicians that you can't put somebody into the academy and then not keep training them after they get out of that academy. And we've by and large failed at that for 50 years.
Okay, just to touch on something that you mentioned. So I've heard you refer to a city or jurisdiction as a sick patient, maybe even a cancer patient, and something like stop, question, frisk, or even proactive policing could almost be considered like a form of medicine, like maybe even a chemotherapy. And I think, as you said, as the patient gets better, less and less of that medicine or that chemotherapy is probably necessary to, have that city, jurisdiction, or victim, stay healthy. And that was something that I think may have been lost a while ago. But it seems now that maybe the patient is getting sick again, and maybe some of that medicine is necessary again, maybe even some of that chemotherapy or radiation. Mm-hmm. How do we find a balance in policing today with the kind of issues that we're facing, social justice-wise? How do we achieve that balance?
I'm actually going to kick that over to John, because John is still in the business. You're still in the business. I'm kind of the old man on the sidelines in the sense I got my thoughts on that. But John, if you don't mind, I'll kick that to you with the idea of it. John has heard me do these medical analogies, anecdotes ad nauseum, because I truly believe in them. But in the sense of your patient at this particular time, and you've been dealing with this patient for 25 years, speaking specifically about New York.
How sick is the patient?
So the patient is getting better, but the patient, has some problems. And just to torture the medical analogy, if you looked at stop and frisk, this was a tactically well-intentioned program, but what was the result? You got 760,000, more than that, people stopped in the course of a single year. Obviously in the neighborhoods where we face the most challenges, because that's where the crime will be, but it's also the neighborhoods where we face the most challenges in terms of trust. And, for 785,000 people, they got 900 guns. I don't know how to do math, but I know that's not a good percentage. On the other hand, what we also got was we alienated entire swaths of that community, particularly of people who were either young men or just coming into adulthood at that time who, this many years later still carry that resentment as adults. Here's the interesting thing, which is, chemotherapy or radiation, spreading it across a wide area, hoping to get to that tumor. That's one way to do it. What we switched to when the commissioner came back was laser surgery. Precision policing is laser surgery. It's like, where exactly, what are the places, peoples, and things that are the drivers of violence? Is it this location? We will apply police to that. Is it this crew? Look who I'm talking to, the gang guy. Is it this crew? Who in that crew are the core shooters and violent actors? Who are the shot callers? We'll apply precision policing to that. And from that, Tom Galati's in the audience, who is the chief of the Intelligence Bureau. His field intelligence officers, it's like, why stop every third guy on the street because you might have seen a bulge and you've got to make that number of stops? When you can say, I'm debriefing every prisoner. This goes back to Jack Maple. Debrief everybody who's arrested on a serious crime.
Just ask.
And they're telling me where the guns are, or they're telling me where the dope is, or they're telling me where there's dope and guns, which is a very common combination. And now I'm going to the DA and I'm getting a search warrant based on an affiant from a confidential informant and the authorization of a prosecutor, which is then signed by a judge. You want to take me to task for it? Okay. But now I have involved every step of the criminal justice system in vetting this, including independently elected jurists. And now I'm going through a door with a lot of authorization. and a lot of information to back that up. And here's the crazy part. Stop and frisk was down 92%, and we ended up getting more guns than stopping 750,000 people by just asking people where are the guns and going to those places. So rounding that out to, so what does that mean today? You know, we're in a backslide in terms of crime numbers. It's interesting where we're backsliding to. Right now, our gun arrests are at 1995 levels. I mean, this is when we were in the NYPD in the first time, and crime was at a completely different place, even though we had started the decline there. When you're making gun arrests at 1995 levels, that's not where our shootings are. Our shootings and murders are both at 2010 levels. So, you know, you hear a lot of people say, oh my God, you know, the wheels have come off the wagon. New York is back to where it was in the 90s. Actually, it's back to where it was in the latter days of the Bloomberg administration's, you know, third term maybe. The public has a reasonable expectation that crime should be as low as it ever was. So if you got it down to here one time, one day, that's the new bottom line. That's where it needs to be. And when you get back down there, you should be trying to figure out how to get it lower. We have some catching up to do. The real issue for us is in the post-bail reform world, in the post-criminal justice reform world, a lot of options that we had for police officers on the street aren't there anymore. A lot of options that a district attorney or a judge had to decide that someone should be incarcerated are also not there anymore. It's not a choice anymore. They're expressly prohibited by state law to act on certain crimes in ways that they always could have. And then there's the COVID piece, which is where we've now backslid to kind of 2010 crime levels on the crimes we're most concerned with, shootings and murders. We are seeing district attorneys' offices that were largely shut down during COVID. We're backlogs of cases. We have 5,000 open gun cases. We're seeing a court system that has been very, very slow to resume operations. We can fill Madison Square Garden for a concert, Yankee Stadium for a ball game. Sorry about that. You know.
Go Sox.
You had to go there. City Field, you know, we're having trouble filling a jury box. You just got to get 12 people in one place. That's taken way too long. And if the entire criminal justice system isn't participating, you're going to get what we're getting, which is a guy gets arrested with a loaded pistol. That's a win. He goes in and then gets released on his own recognizance. And then 4 months later, while that case is still pending, he gets arrested with a loaded pistol. And he goes in, that's a good thing, and then he's released on his own recognizance again. So that's a bail-eligible crime. Those decisions are being made for other reasons. So we've got to get the system's wheels turning together again. Right now, our wheels are spinning pretty fast, but the rest of the system has to join us. And then there's the crisis of having space and the number of personnel in the jails. So, you know, you guys probably have extra room, and I'm sure we
No,
could.
actually, we have no extra room, right, Sheriff?
Fine. It was just an idea. But, so we're facing a lot of
You
challenges.
see, they
but
just killed that idea very quickly.
Yeah, I see that. But I mean, we never slowed down. We never stopped. You know, we had 11,000 people infected with COVID. We lost dozens and dozens of them who passed away. But everybody in the NYPD showed up every day who could and fought the good fight. And now we need all our partners back.
It's the most resilient cops in the world. They continue to do the job every day. It's admirable. So the patient isn't that sick, Dr. Miller, and we can fix it, is what we're saying.
The patient is not going to die.
Okay.
The
good.
patient will recover from this, and it's not as sick as you would read in the papers.
Yep.
But we need our partners.
The recovery, though, John, I would argue, is going to take years. I'm the eternal optimist that some of the jobs I've taken on, you'd have to be an optimist to take them. I drive my wife crazy. I get up in the morning, and it's always a good day, no matter what's going on. But I was at a conference yesterday, and Richard Haas, the head of the Council of Foreign Relations, was the speaker just before me. And he gave a very gloomy report on the state of the world at the moment. And he talked about himself being a pessimistic optimist at this time. And for the first time in my 50 years in this business, I am pessimistic about the moment, because there are so many things that are going on with the patients. Using the term patient, I've worked in over 100 cities, either as chief in 6 of them, or literally around the world with over 100 other police departments. And no 2 cities that I've ever worked in are the same. That they might look the same, and we try to compare all the time, safest line cities, et cetera. But they are all very different. And the skill of a police leader is like a doctor. The idea you want a police leader who effectively can diagnose his or her patient's illnesses and what is the appropriate level of treatment for those illnesses. In my case, as a physician in my cities, every one of them always had 2 illnesses. For most of policing's history in the 70s and 80s, one of those 2 illnesses was not addressed by anybody. And that was quality of life, broken windows, the minor crime. We were too short-staffed. We wanted to do all the sexy stuff, so we focused on serious crime. And it wasn't until New York City in the 90s began in the subway, then in the streets, to focus on both. Because like a doctor working on a patient coming into the trauma room, bad car accident, he's going to work on what's going to kill that person on the table at that time. But others around the table are working on all those other illnesses that, if not addressed over time, will impact the recovery of that patient and possibly kill them. And so policing is the same. It's the idea of understanding. And going back to the stop, question, frisk issue, and I write about this in the book, it's the idea that during Ray's time, he really truly believed that to get crime down, to get guns off the street, was going to require more stop, question, frisk. Much the same as Giuliani back in '94 felt it was going to require more arrests. As John has talked about, the skill of the physician was determining, no, it wasn't carpet bombing with chemo and radiation. It was the idea, identify specifically where you wanted to apply the medicine and then how much. And that's the challenge at the moment, because the public is really sending mixed signals that are really confusing the politicians. Politicians right now in this country, particularly in this state, this city, particularly in New York City and in Albany, really believe that you, the police, are the problem. And that the way to solve the problem is to diminish us, reduce our numbers, reduce our powers. In the meantime, you're hearing from their constituents. And I just don't understand why they're not hearing from their constituents, that they want the police there at 3 o'clock in the morning when the gang on the corner is raising hell, or the dirt bikes are running wild on a Sunday afternoon through the neighborhood. That the challenge at the moment is the way we did it back in the 90s, people came to understand the importance of dealing with quality of life, dealing with serious crime. Somewhere along the line, in the last couple of years in particular, as John talks about, the wheels went off. The challenge for you is how to get those wheels back on. And what you're hearing from the public, get that into the ears and the minds of the political leadership. And the reason I'm a pessimistic optimist at the moment, I just look at the political leadership in this state, this country, this city, and I just don't see it being responsive at the moment to some of these, what I think are very valid arguments that we're making for the need for more police, more training, that we have a leadership at the moment that doesn't get it. In some respects, and this is where understanding history comes in, we've been there before. In the 70s, I saw the same thing. In the 80s, I saw the same thing. And then finally, in the 90s, we started getting political leadership, whether it was Giuliani, right-wing Republican, Bill Clinton, left of center Democrat. They came together around the idea of we need to do something about this problem. So I've been there before in '93 and '94 when I was sitting in the White House with Clinton, Giuliani, and Newt Gingrich. Talk about three totally different political leaders where they came together around this crisis. So I've been there before and saw where it could happen, and it did happen. And we became authorized to effectively get the job done. 100,000 more cops, laws that work to our benefit.
Assault weapons ban.
Assault weapons ban, domestic violence legislation. It kills me to see politicians run away from the crime bill of 1994, because it's effectively what saved this country at that time. So despite my pessimism of the moment, I'm optimistic based on my appreciation of history, having lived history where we were in similar circumstances, different variety of illnesses, but similar circumstances. And so the challenge for you, I would argue, is to know more about the history, and as you go forward, basically try working together collaboratively to effectively basically seize the moment, if you will, to see the challenges that are out there as opportunities. And it's some days, and Ricky hates to hear me say this, I wish I was still back in the game. Most days I don't, but some days I do. Because I look at these challenges and the excitement of taking them on, but it's not to be. So I'll stand on the sidelines and cheer you on as you wrestle with them going forward.
You know, not to go backwards, but I think one of the things that you both had a tremendous role in was the institution of CompStat, and I think it really transformed policing. And it's something, much to the chagrin of some of my members, we recently introduced in the Sheriff's Department. And I am in love with the system. I think it's, you know, a game changer. And if you guys can maybe just talk a little bit about how that came to be and kind of what your opinion is of how it transformed policing.
Let me talk about the origins of it from my perspective. And then, John, if I could ask you to talk about lanes. That in the 70s, that as a young lieutenant being put in charge of a neighborhood policing program in one of the toughest districts in Boston, District 4, terrible time in that city. That's where all West Fenway Park, Boston University, Northeastern University, Museum of Fine Arts, high crime neighborhood. Patrons weren't coming to the symphony. They were at risk of literally, this was the heart and soul of the vitality of Boston. And they came together in collaboration, 29 institutions, and went to the police department and said, we need your help. We are willing to fund a special effort in this police district to try and get a handle on the crime and the disorder. And I was selected, I was working in the commissioner's office at that time, to head up this initiative, the Boston Fenway program. And I was a whiz kid back in those days. Computers were just coming into being. I used to arm myself with those 3-foot-long green sheets that would roll off the computers. I had those crime stats down. And I'd go to meetings. I'd hold 4 neighborhood meetings a week, Monday through Thursday. First time in the history of Boston that we actually went out and told people, come to meetings, meet your local police. And I was very surprised to learn very quickly that I was focused, like the Boston police and like American policing, on serious crime. We were getting pretty good at tracking it, computers, analysis of it. And almost never came up in these community meetings. What came up was the prostitute, the gang on the corner, the graffiti. And so my understanding of the importance of quality of life in addition to serious crime. But on the serious crime side of it, what I started doing, because I worked in a very busy crime district, I couldn't get a handle on, every day I'd have a stack of papers on my desk of the crime reports the night before. It was very difficult to basically understand it all. So we put a couple maps up on the wall, had a student intern to come in at night, put dots on the map that basically, as soon as you see these patterns and clusters, hotspots start to develop. And then I started doing directed patrols on my electric typewriter every Sunday for all of my sector cars to be here for an hour. This is what you're looking for. This is the problem. And we put those maps up in the guard room. So in 1970, the underpinning of CompStat, I was already experiencing the success of it. So in the 90s, coming into New York City, if you think of the complexity of crime in Boston and then the complexity of crime in New York compounded 100-fold, this is where the brilliance of Maple and Anamone came into the picture, and with the encouragement of John keeping Maple Company up at Elaine's. John, if you can take the story forward from there.
So, I mean, the challenge that Jack and the commissioner faced at the time was, we decided that the department would no longer just be reactive, that we would actually develop codified strategies. And we came out with these white papers, the gun strategy, the auto theft strategy, the robbery strategy, the youth violence strategy, the domestic violence strategy. And it said, this was our past practice, and this is our current practice. You will, you shall, you must. And it said, we're going to operate on a certain standard that is not dependent on what the individual's response was going to be to the problem. There was a quality of life strategy, which was an entire crime strategy about the most minor crimes, but the things driving people crazy. And, we realized no cop or likely commander is going to carry around a 27-page white paper and refer to that in the middle of a call. So we reduced them to booklets where you could it could be in the visor of the car. And if you had to say, in a gun arrest, what does the strategy require now? We're going to have to, run the serial number and then the shell casings and do comparisons and things that people either used to do or maybe not do, depending. And what we found was, one day I ran into Jack in the elevator. And I'm like, you look like shit. And he said, I'm not sleeping because I'm going to these crime scenes and then I'm going to the precinct and I'm looking at the ComStat board and the colored push pins and the dots. And I'm asking, were these prisoners debriefed? Why not? Well, there was no one in the squad. Why wouldn't somebody else debrief them? Was this gun run through this? And he said, some places are doing all of it. Some places are doing some of it. And some places are doing none of it. He said, this is what we got. We got true believers. We got passive people who, if it's okay if they get around to it. And then we've got what he called the conscientious objectors. I'm not doing it. I'm still showing up every day, but I'm not doing it. And he said, unless the whole thing comes together, we're going to lose. So he said, I'm going to stop going to precincts in the middle of the night and looking at those boards. They're going to come to me. We're going to do a meeting every week, borough by borough. We're going to put up the maps, even if we have to put the colored pins in and, recreate them there. It was before we had a laptop, before we had mapping software, before we had anything. We had Dunkin' Donuts and warm coffee.
And fax machines.
And fax machines and maps with colored push pins in them. And it was going to be, you didn't get in trouble if your crime went up. You got a very happy response if your crime went down. You got in trouble if they said, what were the situation that was driving crime in your precinct, in your area, and you couldn't answer the questions because you didn't have the intimacy, the accountability, the level of awareness, which had never been required before. So this had to be learned. And Jack was kind of struggling with, well, what are we after here? I mean, we got to break it down to something simple, something people can recite. If we turn it into another white paper, it's just going to gather dust somewhere. And one night we were in Elaine's, and he got a stack of napkins.
One night of many.
It was just this one night. And I mean, at least I could say I don't remember the rest of them. And he got this stack of napkins, and he started writing different versions. Get the correct information, make sure deployments are this. No, throw a napkin away. No, that's not it. And then he came up with timely and accurate intelligence, effective tactics. Do we know what the issues are, the crime, the problems? Effective tactics. Are we responding to them with something that will work? Rapid deployment. Are we doing that right away to nip it in the bud? Relentless follow-up and assessment. If it works one time, do we just move on and wait for it to come back? No, we're back there doing the same thing again and again. He said, that's it, timely, accurate intelligence, effective tactics, rapid deployment, relentless follow-up. And he said, these are the principles of ComStat. And he stuffed the napkin in his pocket. That is emblazoned, across the wall of the ComStat room. That has become the mantra that has been followed by the NYPD and its command staff and replicated in cities first across the country and then across the world, because it was an accountability system that compensated for the true believers. We could learn from them because they would innovate. It was finding people who had better ideas to do the same things in different ways than you thought of.
That's how we found you.
The go along to get along people, we could make them better by exposing them to the others who were leaning into this and succeeding. And the conscientious objectors, we could weed them out, either by turning them into true believers or finding something else for them to do and bringing up, from the team, the people who had the new ideas, the better ideas. And that's what CompStat became. What's interesting is you're an agency that's going into CompStat now as kind of a new thing, and it is a process that has stages. I was with Chief Bratton when we implemented CompStat in the LAPD. It was a shock to the organization system. They had it, but under a different name, and it wasn't really an accountability system. It was kind of an inventory system. What's going on? Do we know about it? Is it being addressed vaguely? And we had to jack that up.
Quick story on the LAPD CompStat, the first one I attended, that there was a female, LA has 4 bureaus and about 18 divisions within those 4 bureaus. And this was a bureau chief. And I was not chief at that time. Bernard Parks had actually asked me to come in and take a look at his CompStat to see how it matched up. And I had Jack Maple with me. And this would have been late 90s. And the female deputy chief at the time, she gets up to give her CompStat report, and most of it was around the idea of the successful parade that they had just policed, and that she was really very pleased that most of the cops wore their hats. In LA, nobody ever wears a hat except in formal occasions. So her CompStat report in one of the highest crime bureaus of the department focused largely on the cops wearing their hats. Maple and I were just beside ourselves. Needless to say, when I took over as chief of the LAPD a couple of years later, she was one of the first to go. That she got off the bus very quickly because she just didn't have it, just didn't understand it.
But as an organization going into this, the stages that I've seen, I watched it go into Newark. I watched it, we implemented it in the FBI. Talk about a shock to the system. That's not an agency that considers itself responsible for crime because that's the cops' problem. They just do FBI stuff. But, this was applying it to terrorism, to intelligence, to other things. And, you get to, in the beginning, if you're putting it in your agency, you're going to find it's clunky because you need to get a feel for it. People need to figure out how it works. It's not going to start off smoothly every time. And the first few meetings will be the finding your way part. Then you start to find successes in it because you're finding out things you didn't know and you're implementing strategies that you hadn't used and you're starting to see things work. Then there's a risk stage. And that's where one of 2 bad things can happen. Either people are uncomfortable about being held accountable or called out. So everybody decides we've got to make this way more polite. There's nothing wrong with being civil or polite, but uncomfortable questions are not asked, and awkward moments are avoided. And then it kind of becomes a toothless process that makes people feel like they're doing it. And, agencies will say, yeah, we tried CompStat. You know what? It didn't work. We're like, you probably didn't do it right. Or there's the opposite, which is it becomes the jousting between the people at the front table and the people at the podium where you can fall into the risk of trivial pursuit. I did all the research into their stuff and I found the one thing I can catch them on and that's going to be my big moment. That's 2 sides of the same pendulum. It goes too soft or it gets non-substantive. If you can get through all 3 of those stages to the place where everybody knows what it's for and how it works, and that some days are going to be tough and some days are going to be very successful, and that's what propels the organization forward, then you've hit your stride. And it's a process.
A caution for you, Kevin, as you're starting into it, or those of you from other agencies that are either doing it or thinking about doing it, that this goes back to the doctor-patient analogy, that case of NYPD with 76, 77 precincts. No 2 of those precincts were exactly alike. And so while back going 94, 95, we had these 7 crime priorities: domestic violence, guns, youth crime, many of them were linked together. Some of these precincts didn't have those problems. The 123, the 123 out in Staten Island, the only police station had a screen door on it for all the flies out in farm country. Most of the things that we were focused on as a department, they didn't have those issues. So expecting them to come into Compstat and talk about gun crime, the only gun crime they had was some farmer out there basically shooting at the pigeons. That you need to allow for variations of prioritization, that this is where the delegation and discretion comes in, that the precinct commander is effectively his or her own police commissioner, and need to allow them to have some leeway to establish priorities in their particular precinct. And I was invited by John after he had convinced Mueller to implement Compstat at the FBI. I was the chief in LA after Mueller had stolen John away from me. And I went into one of the Compstats. And what do you have? You have 59 officers, I think. In the
56.
56. And so basically they do a Compstat with 7 or 8 of these officers. And his priority at that time, as you might appreciate, was terrorism. The FBI had moved begrudgingly from focus on crime to terrorism. Agents weren't happy about it. SACs weren't happy about it. It was a very different world, and was a less exciting world in many respects because there were very few terrorists to find. It was looking for the needle in the haystack, and was less satisfying than getting the bank robber and the more instantaneous gratification of what they've been working on for 50 years, J. Edgar Hoover. And I still remember watching Mueller, and I don't think Mueller quite got it because the priority of terrorism. He was going after each of them for the prioritization on terrorism. What are you doing in your area about terrorism? And some of them were really floundering because they just didn't have active information that they could follow up on in their area. But what Mueller would then try to do with them was to understand that you still, while you have your priorities, the terrorism issue is one that the reality is, it is the needle in the haystack, but we don't want to miss the needle. So it is the idea of giving discretion and leeway to the priorities in a particular area, but to still focus on the department-wide priorities, and particularly as it relates to terrorism, as you don't want that mess that we had on 9/11, which was literally the idea that opportunities were missed and investigations not conducted.
You know, we're running out of time, and I'm glad that you brought up the terrorism issue because I think, you know, both of you have done a phenomenal job over the years keeping 2 of the biggest cities in America safe. You know, Commissioner Miller, I know you've been at it for a long time now, and going back to 2001 in New York City, there's been 51 plots against the city. Nobody has to tell you that. I believe it's 5 or 6 successful and only 1 with fatalities, right? And every fatality is too many. And I know we both remember that one well because it was right outside of our office. But, you know, again, we don't have a tremendous amount of time to talk about it, but, you know, phenomenal job by all counts. I just want to, before I open it up to the audience for some questions, Commissioner Miller, you know, speaking of terrorism, I know you've interviewed some of the worst, right? Including Osama Bin Laden, the last person, I believe, to do that in pretty much any environment.
I think that record's going to remain safe.
I think you're right. Thank God. The idiot who blew himself up in the subway, Ullah, one of the first at the scene. You actually interviewed him in person while he was laying on the ground with holes in his body, along with Chief Galati. Absolutely amazing. Saipov, I know you got a chance to speak to in the hospital. John Gotti. Most of the rest of the Gambino family as well. So you sat across the table from you know, all of these different horrific people. Who's the worst of the worst? Who's the worst person, the person that you that really made your skin crawl?
It would have to be Bin Laden, only because he was so plain and direct about his intentions. You know, the John Gottis of the world would always play it off. But Bin Laden sat there as close as I am to the commissioner and said, I declare war on America. This will be greater than our war with the Russians in Afghanistan. I know you think you're a superpower that can prevail over anything, but after we defeated the Russians and the walls fell, they lost the Soviet Union and their country fell apart. I predict a black day for America, after which the United States will also not be united, and that you will only understand this when you are dragging the bodies and the coffins and boxes in your shameful defeat. And, you know, when we got that translated in, you know, the last days of May of 1998, that sounded like a little bit of a stretch. You know, I was in those mountains, I was in those caves, I was in those buildings. Those were not the guys that you thought were going to take on a superpower. If you had played the same interview on September 12th, 2001, it sounded like it had been done the day before. So, you know, what you got from Bin Laden was a guy who decided that he was just that important, that he could declare a war, not as a state or a nation, that he could take so many lives, 3,000 in multiple locations on a single day, that there would be something okay about that in terms of humanity, and that he could then promise to do it again. Probably the worst person I will ever meet. God, I hope so. And
Guess that was an easy one, huh?
And it was a real wake-up call.
Playing off of John's comments about terrorism dealing with bin Laden, that when I, based on my awareness of John, his skills, that we had stayed in touch after he served as DCPI. DCPI in some respects was a natural. Somebody who had worked in the media all his life, knew the city inside out, knew the department. So even then it was seen as a stretch to bring this reporter in as the Deputy Commissioner of Public Information. An even bigger stretch was the idea of bringing this fat little transit police lieutenant into basically be the Deputy Commissioner for Crime Control Strategies. It goes back to my earliest point about leadership, about the idea of one of the challenges of leadership, but one of the excitement aspects of it is risk-taking. And the risk-taking in selection of personnel is always potentially fraught with peril when you go outside the normal lanes, if you will, the normal traditional promotion track, 1-star chief to 2-star, 2 to 3. In the case of both LA and New York, and Boston for that matter, the Short Times Commissioner, I had the luxury of being able to bring in outsiders as well as double, triple, quadruple jump promotions in the organization to take risk. And in the case of Maple, the risk I took, bringing him into the NYPD, we all benefit from that 25 years later with the city that it's safe as it became. John, several years later, asking him to come in as the chief of counterterrorism in the LAPD, one, to come in from the outside of a department that never had had an outside chief, always had promoted from within, to come in and deal with, at that time, the most significant crises in America, terrorism, was a phenomenal risk on my part. But it was informed by us staying in touch for 6 years and knowing the intimacy he had on this issue, which is reflected in his book, The Cell. He's one of the foremost experts in the country on this issue. Yet when I appointed him to that position, it was foo-foo. The media went after it. We still have the copies in the newspapers. LAPD, they couldn't believe it. Who the hell is this character coming in? He's going to be a chief. And that one of the great things about being a leader is that you are able to take risks. And one of the things I've always taken great risks at is the idea of finding people and taking a chance on them. And almost without exception, it's worked for me. It's not just me sometimes, it's me being advised by others that, for example, Jack Maple, take the risk of bringing in a John Maple. Jack Maple, a couple of people that basically, Jack was not particularly well liked in circles in New York City, but a couple of people, really, Dean Esserman. Dean Esserman was the one that turned me on to Jack Maple. Dean said, you gotta meet this guy really gets it. Meanwhile, nobody else in New York was singing Jack's praises. And I think, John, didn't you actually meet Jack through an investigation of him?
Yeah.
That the irony of basically you investigating him for the idea of fixing the books, or cooking the books or something, decoy unit. So the idea of risk-taking, and even John coming back as Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism, combining those two bureaus in the NYPD, that was foo-foo when that happened, despite his having served in the FBI, DNI, running counterterrorism in the LAPD. Because why? It was this idea of, once again, bringing the outsider in, despite Ray Kelly having broken the mold and had done it by bringing in his predecessors. But it goes back to the earlier point about the discussion around leadership. One of the benefits is the luxury of taking risk. One of the negatives is taking risk, because sometimes it does work out. But I think if you're careful about it, that it will pay off. Certainly it's paid off in the relationship I've had with John and a lot of the people we've been talking about. And that's going back to the point about CompStat, maybe close on this before opening up for your questions. Something that CompStat is really not known for, and John touched on it, is accountability. It's accountability in the sense that getting up in front of your peers and basically showing your skills, your ideas. But for a chief of department, commissioner in my case, the accountability, I have the accountability for the success of the department, and to be successful, I need the right people in the right seats. CompStat allowed me to go sit in that room twice a week and look into the bowels of the organization by insisting that sergeants, squad commanders come in with their captains and their division chiefs and their bureau chiefs. You got to see, in my case, I was responsible for 1,000 captains, deputy inspectors, chiefs. How the hell am I supposed to, as an outsider, I don't know the history of these people. But when that promotion list would come up with their picture and their bio, I would have had the opportunity to see them in action in CompStat. So CompStat also provided an opportunity for them to get on the stage, understanding it's showtime. Show what you can do. If you want to be noticed, that's the place to get noticed. But understand, if you're full of bullshit, it's going to be noticed. Because you're going to have all your peers around you, and it's going to become quickly apparent you don't know what the hell you're doing. And so CompStat has an additional accountability. It has the added strength for a police leader, the ability, in our case, a sheriff, to literally see his or her people in a very different way, under a lot of pressure, as John indicates, but it gives some a chance to shine, some a chance to fail. I replaced 75% of my precinct commanders within the first year on the advice of Chimney, Maple, Anamone. A lot of them moved up. Some of them moved down, but they moved down into other positions where they were not skilled as crime fighters. We needed crime fighters at the time, but some of them were great administrators. Some of them were great teachers. Some of them were great leaders. It's just a matter of putting a round peg in the round hole on the bus analogy, getting them into the right seats. And then they thrived in those right seats.
All right, great. Do you have time for a couple of questions? I know you got to go.
We're fine. You've got an audience here that, in terms, you know the timing on this.
Okay. Paul, do you want to see if there's a couple of questions, knowing that...
Doing a great job. Change is good. We learned that today.
but knowing that the commissioner is
Actually,
already over time.
Kevin, you're good. You are putting the lights up so we can see who the hell we're looking at
Do you
here.
have any questions that anyone would like to ask? Stand up.
This is CompStat. Chance to be noticed.
This is your chance.
Just don't ask any dumb questions.
I know I asked pretty much most of the questions that could be
Sure.
asked. But.
Commissioners, if you had the opportunity today to speak to our politicians that are passing some of these out-of-sight laws,
Stupid-ass laws.
what would you say to them?
I try to do that actually through my social media site, my Twitter site, etc. I comment very frequently on the stupidity of what they're doing, because a lot of what they are doing is just pure stupidity. Some of it's well-intentioned, but ill-informed. So I try to, the smaller soapbox I have, the best soapbox in America is still as police commissioner in New York City. We found we're in LA, it was a smaller soapbox that had some impact, but what Dermot Shea is trying to do within the political limitations that he has to operate in, he's been pretty forceful in pushing back on a lot of what's going on. And that's the risk-taking as police commissioner, that there's an obligation to use that soapbox to advance what you believe in. I have it easier in terms of, I'm in the private sector now, I can say a lot more of what I want to say without concern about operating under the umbrella of political leadership. Difficult to do that, and I compliment John and Dermot They're up against great odds with this city council, this legislature up in Albany at the moment, for that matter at the national government level, that this is a tough time. But this is also a time that there's a good story to tell about what police are doing. And one of the stories to tell is around the issue of technology. And one of the first frustrations that John and I have, the technology that's out there now, the 5G technology that Verizon, AT&T, and the rest of able to promote, the things you're going to be able to do with that, the excitement of it. I started the job with a pocket full of dimes and a call box key. That was my technology, finding a call box that you could basically get a call at the police station, teletype machines. Look at the average cop today, what he's carrying around on that $3,000 radio with the multiple channels, the ability to collaborate, the smartphone, the cameras, the body cameras. From a management standpoint, look at all the tools you have to manage and supervise. And that technology explosion, one of the great frustrations at the moment is the idea of not being able to use it. Artificial intelligence, facial recognition, the robot dog, the idea that you had these idiots at the city council that basically went after the department because they were, God forbid, experimenting with a robot dog. Instead of sending a cop in, they could send a robot in and basically let them blow up the damn robot rather than blow up a cop. But the mental midgets that basically are in these political seats don't get it. It's all about theater to them. So some of your obligation is within some of the limitations is to either through your leadership organizations, major city chiefs, IACP, where they have the umbrella of protection that you might not have as a police leader, police commissioner, police chief. But the obligation, wherever possible, to tell it like it is. It's so important. And I think John, some of John's frustration when I was commissioner or chief was telling it like it was, telling it like it is, that I'd go off message was the term they used.
Yes, he had this odd attachment to the truth.
You could always, we would have one of these 20 camera arrays, which was the average press conference in the NYPD. And it would be interesting that the skilled camera people who covered these things all the time watched for nuances when something was going to happen. And you could, they could tell when I was getting ready to go off the reservation because the little red lights would start coming on the cameras and the cameras would start focusing in. That's when John started worrying, uh-oh, what's he going to say?
Yes, I had a commissioner who had no unspoken thoughts. But he told the truth, informed the public. And, you know, the answer to your question is, you can talk to the politicians, but then you're just jousting. What we've had the most success is talking to the public and giving them the facts and let them talk to the politicians. And I say that because a politician took me on the side when I was saying, you know, you guys need to change this and you guys need to change that. And he said, no politician will ever do anything that they don't think is the will of the people, because that's how they get elected. And if they think it's going to get them unelected, even if it's the right thing, they're not going to do it. So now we're starting to see people come around to question, what have our politicians done to us? And that is a place where we've started to begin to see the swinging of the pendulum the other way. Because if you talk directly to the public and the politicians begin to hear from them, they're going to ask themselves, what have I gotten myself into now by listening to, you know, some vociferous advocates who claim to represent the masses, but who actually don't. That's why it's always good to be sheriff. You know, at the FBI Academy, we used to teach at NEI. And, you know, we used to ask questions like that to police chiefs. What would you do in this situation? And they would say, well, I'd go to the city manager, and then I'd confer with the council, and then, you know, we might write a letter. And, you know, said, okay, chief, what would you do? I would, you know, get a position paper and form a committee. He would say, all right, sheriff, what would you do? He said, I'd give him hell, tell him go to hell, and I'm not going to do it. And I'm like, okay, so I noticed in the class the sheriffs are different in terms of strategy on pushback than the chiefs. What's that about? And the sheriff said, let me explain this to you, Mr. Miller. The police chief has to kiss one ass every day. That's the mayor. The sheriff has to kiss every ass in the county, but only once every 4 years. So it was a will of the people thing. It's just a theory.
Sounds good.
I think we have time for one more question.
Was that based on the clock or that last answer?
No, that was the clock.
Yeah, gentleman over here to the right. Let me give you a perspective on Adams that I've known Eric going back to 1990 when he was a lieutenant in the transit police, just at that time really starting to break out in terms of some of the organizations he created to advocate for blacks in law enforcement. And known him over that 30-year period of time. He's very close with Jack Maple over the years. That of the mayoral candidates that ran, and let's face it, it was an awful pool of candidates that ran, he was the one that I would have been supportive of if I was publicly endorsing. And why? Because I think he gets it. Whether or not he's able to do anything about it with the city council that has 41 new members, or the crazy legislature up in Albany, which is getting crazier all the time. I think he has the best chance, certainly the pool of candidates that ran for mayor, but maybe the best chance of anybody I'm aware of in the city or the state at the moment. That because one, he's extraordinarily articulate. He's not afraid of the cameras, that he enjoys the cameras, and that's critical. John used to joke about me that I never met a camera I didn't like. I haven't, because I understood back in the old days you needed all those cameras to tell your story. Now we have Twitter, we have social media.
Okay, but also if he went downstairs to the kitchen at 3 in the morning to get a glass of milk and open the refrigerator door, if the light came on, he gave a press conference. That's a good thing, but needs to be managed.
And I think Eric has a lot of good ideas. What's going to be critical watching that first month is who does he surround himself with? Who does he put in at your department in terms of the leadership team at the department? Does it make a splash initially, or does it sink as soon as he announces it? That first month, that first 30 days is going to be absolutely critical. And I think in this case of me in '94 with Giuliani, the splash, we didn't sink. We actually basically made a pretty good wave coming out of it. Same thing in LA. So we have to watch those first 30 days. What he does in the idea of his selection of key personnel is going to be critical. But of everybody I understand that's in politics in the city right now, he's the one I'd have the most hope for, in the sense of fingers crossed. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, both
Thank
of
you
you.
all.
It's been
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thanks for your patience.
Really appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Kevin. You might have a future as an interviewer.